Of headlines, 4 Paris-based correspondents here on set with me to give me our views, their views and opinions. We have the very opinionated Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, the no less opinionated Chris Dickey, Paris bureau chief for the Newsweek magazine and columnist for the Daily Beast. We have with us as well Craig Kopitas, a regular on this show. Craig, Paris-based journalist, author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo, and Tony Cruañez, Paris correspondent for the Spanish public broadcaster TV3. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much to all our guests for being with us this week. And this week we start with Syria, which has seen a fresh round of violence, another escalation in brutality. Just 2 weeks after the Hula massacre shocked the international community with more than 108 people killed, many of them children, another massacre, this time in the hamlet of Mazrat al-Kubayr, near the town of Hama. It seems half the village was killed, at least 55 people. It's believed plainclothes militias from neighboring Alawite villages hacked, stabbed, or shot the residents. Kofi Annan admits his peace plan is not being implemented. Let's listen to Kofi Annan.
It is an honor.
Despite the acceptance of the 6-point plan and the deployment of a courageous mission of United Nations observers to Syria, I must be frank and confirm that the plan is not being implemented.
Chris Dickey, not much of a surprise, is it?
No surprise at all. I mean, you know, in some ways, it's just as well that the Russians and the Chinese are making it so hard to do anything in Syria, because nobody knows what to do in Syria. The truth is, if the Russians and Chinese came out tomorrow and said, oh yes, let's support Chapter 7, let's open up the possibility of a military intervention in Syria, the Americans would go, oh, we've got to think about that. So in the meantime, Kofi Annan has just been killing time. He's come up with a peace plan that was never going to work. Everybody could see it wasn't going to work. Everybody is just killing time, and a lot of Syrians are getting killed in that process.
And Elizabeth, I see you raising your eyebrows.
Well, but you actually completed that statement when you said he's killing time, he's also killing people, but he's not the only one to kill people. What we're looking at something that reminds me very much Bosnia in the the former Yugoslavia in the 90s,
or Lebanon in the 70s,
or where I wasn't there in the 70s, but I'm pretty sure. And what you've got something that is not so much like the other example where we had an international intervention, which is Libya, because here you don't really, they are side to side. I mean, there's no territorial discontinuity, so that where do you regroup, what do you attack? We have this last village, which was where the last massacre took place. This massacre is more or less, they've identified Alawites. We have no idea whether this was not actually an answer to a massacre we did not hear about, which was perpetrated by another side. And it's going to go on and get worse, because that's the revenge is the way these things are done, and there are no identifiable sides, no identifiable regions, except for a small Kurd region, and the Kurds are not really sort of into this.
So this is the beginning of a more brutal phase in the conflict, even more brutal.
Well, yeah, I mean, am I the only one whose stomach turns when they hear Kofi Annan use the word courageous? Look.
Referring to
Mr. Rwanda and Mr. Bosnia.
Yeah, right. Look, there's a civil war going on in Syria. We don't have to wait for some alleged Solon from the United Nations to stand up and say there's a civil war going on. The Russians aren't going to let anyone in. The Chinese aren't going to want anyone to go in, because that would open their countries up to outside influence, a policy that goes back to the Cold War days. You use the word brutal. It is brutal, and we should be just as brutal towards these people who are running, this country. One of the reasons that no one cares about Syria, and there are many, is Syria doesn't make anything. So the only thing Syria is making right now is corpses. Mm-hmm. And so far, according to the opposition, They've made 6,000 of them since this happened. Well, on the world...
Estimates range anywhere between 6,000 and 13,000 people
fine.
killed.
What's
a
few thousand more corpses amongst dictators? On the world market right now, you can get, if you extract all the body parts, you can get about $45 million, believe it or not, can go that high for a human corpse if you take out all the...
They're not selling
tendons.
them.
Well, they could. You know, you want to be brutal about it? Let's be brutal about this guy. He's stacking up bodies in a warehouse.
Well, let's be brutal about it, but what do you do?
I don't know.
But
that's not, our job is to tell people what we see. And this is what we see going on in Syria.
Yeah, but Kofi Annan's job is to try and do something about it. I'm not making excuses for Kofi Annan.
If you wanted to be brutal, let's be brutal. Let's say the truth. The normal behavior of the international community is what it's doing now. I mean, what we've seen in the last years, we talk about Libya, we talk about Afghanistan, we talk about Iraq. These are the exceptions. Normally, the international community does nothing. Does envoy Kofi Annan or another ex-Secretary General of the UN, and well, they kill time and they try to see if the situation solves itself.
It won't.
It won't happen.
Is there a level of brutality, a level of violence, or since you want to put it bluntly, a number of dead that will kickstart the international community into doing something?
Not in Syria.
No, I don't see it.
Not in Syria. I mean, one of the confusions about the Libyan intervention, which Anne Elizabeth brought up, is this idea that it was a moral intervention and it was all driven by moral imperatives. It wasn't. Partly it was driven by oil imperatives, I'm sure Craig would say, but it was also driven by the practicalities. It was possible to do something in Libya. It's not possible to do something in Syria unless you want to put boots on the ground in massive numbers, unless you want to repeat Iraq, repeat Afghanistan, and I can tell you, nobody's ready to repeat Iraq or Afghanistan.
So maybe what it needs, okay, is a good old-fashioned civil war. The United States had a civil war. Most countries have had civil wars.
No, but it's not going to happen this way.
Well, then what else are you going to do?
Well, no, what you wind up with, what you wind up with is a civil war that's a very messy, sectarian, divided war, like the Balkans, like Lebanon, where people have to bleed themselves dry before anything happens.
In international relations, that a conflict has to go to its bloody end in order to be definitively resolved.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm against that. I mean, I can't say that.
Morally, we're all against it.
No, not just only morally, but I really think that the problem here is that Westerners cannot get into Syria like that. I mean, not after all the experiences we've seen in the last few years. It would be not accepted, not just for Syria, but for all the nearly all the other countries around them. The problem here is that the Arab League should do something. And at the same time, the other problem, of course, and this is more academically, is to talk that we're not talking about one conflict. It's a lot of conflicts in one place. But actually, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Israel here. We're talking still about Turkey and Iraq.
I don't see
that
Saudi
is the big
Arabia
problem in Syria.
Sending peacekeepers in or sending troops in. You see a lot of talk and a lot of jibber-jabber about diplomatic minutiae that will not take place in trying to solve the Syrian problem. I think, Chris is right. At some point, if you want to clean this mess up, you do need boots on the ground, and no one's going to do that.
That's right.
Well, Kofi Annan's new approach is that he says he's engaged in talks to bring together a new contact group that would include regional players such as Iran, he mentioned. He hoped Iran could be part of the solution. Now, United States and France are against that. Let's move on to Egypt now. Egypt at a crossroads. The week in Egypt began with a lifelong jail sentence handed down to former leader Hosni Mubarak. Protesters were furious at the verdict, which some of them found too lenient. They would have liked a death penalty. But they quickly directed their anger at more pressing matters, the presidential election. Well, the vote is in just over 1 week's time, and some Egyptians demand that courts apply a law that would ban Mubarak's former Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq from running on the grounds that he was a member of the old regime. The problem is, Shafiq not only ran in this election, he's made it to the second round. So with the court scheduled to rule on this next week, every scenario seems possible at this point, including canceling this long-awaited election. Egypt really is at a crossroads right now, Anne Elizabeth.
It is, and actually cancelling the election might not be such a bad idea, because even in the first round, 2 of the candidates who were going to poll quite a lot of votes were not allowed to run. It's very obvious that at the stage where they're at, if half the candidates who would poll votes and therefore represent something in the country are not allowed to vote, the system has not reached the maturity that would enable us to hold an election that would then sort of enable the country to start forward. So cancelling the election might not be such a bad thing, but I'm not sure it would be a very popular thing in the country. The other thing is, who are the people who express themselves in Egypt? Because we've seen time and again since it started a year and a half ago, you get 1 million, 2 million, 3 million people in Cairo, and they do not represent a country of between 70 and 80 million inhabitants, and which is why then you get sort of local elections and general elections, and they vote for the Muslim Brotherhood in large numbers, and these people were not in the street.
And this is what our correspondents in Cairo have been saying. You can't mistake Egyptians for just the people who are on Tahrir Square. The revolutionaries do not speak for all of Egypt.
And I don't think we should confuse the will of the masses with democracy either. Democracy, as it really functions, is a matter of organization. What are the 2 parties that came out on top after the first round? The 2 best organized, the Muslim Brotherhood and the candidate of the military, basically. They were the ones who came out on top, and that's what's contending right now.
And it's a very close call, just about 1 percentage point between the 2.
Yes, to the extent that you can trust, polls at all in Egypt, which you really can't. We'll see how it comes out. But I think whoever loses, it's going to get very messy.
Are you that negative on their first truly democratic elections? I mean, they had the parliamentary elections a few months ago, and now the presidential election.
I'm not negative in the sense that I think it's great that there's a political process and political play. It's going to get very messy, though. We shouldn't delude ourselves about that. Whoever comes out in second place out of these elections, which I don't think are going to be canceled, is going to be very angry. They're not going to take it lying down. Everybody will claim fraud.
Do any of you agree with a theory that is prevalent, at least on Tahrir Square, if not elsewhere in Cairo, that it is actually the military council pulling all the strings, deciding for the courts in place of the judges because they want to stay in power? Is that a theory that sounds reasonable? A lot of people on Tahrir Square seem to think that.
It sounds reasonable because actually what we are seeing is just the Muslim Brotherhood having a big success in the elections, but at the same time the candidate that represents the Ancien Regime, which is also winning very clearly in the next few days, if not the election, at least the legitimacy of being seen as the main opposition. Then what I think I agree on the point that it's negative, the fact that democracy is not just elections, but is making it work. But at the same time, I would like to be positive today. Maybe next week we will have to talk about being more negative. But the positive part of it is that after a year, there's been a process that is being really quite democratic for a country like Egypt. And in fact, the fact that we've got the 2 contenders that actually represent both different points of view, it's a real confrontation. This is exactly what happens in our countries. The problem is that democracy is definitely not as mature as it is in other countries.
No, not mature at all. I mean, I think the great losers, ironically, of this. I mean, I was in Tahrir back in the beginning of the revolution. Were you there?
Yes,
you were there as well.
I went there the day after Mubarak fell.
All right. So we were all there pretty much the same time. And the people who were in that square, who were making the revolution happen, they are the big losers in this electoral process. They are the ones who are not represented by this contest between the very well-organized Muslim Brotherhood and the very well-organized military party.
Who's going to pay for it going forward? The question that I'm really curious to see answered down the road is Egypt. Most experts on Egypt tend to agree that without the $2 billion plus a year from the United States, Egypt can't really function. So
it can't even function with those $2 million. If you look at the way Egypt is run, if you look at
it kind of keeps it creaking along. What I find interesting here is if the Muslim Brotherhood is victorious, will the U.S. keep paying the $2 billion? And if they don't, will someone within the Muslim world come in, such as the Iranians or someone else, to basically underwrite whatever new government is there?
Can the Muslim Brotherhood not make a deal with the U.S., or can the U.S. afford not to make a deal with whoever wins the election there?
Define deal. Define deal. What is a deal?
Deal is like you are there, I'm here, we are going to be friends, aren't we?
If they're elected, it's an elected government. I mean, they probably still will have diplomatic relationships because Egypt also, if they break diplomatic relationships, if they do things that really annoy the Americans, then the other thing is that they will lose tourism, in which case they will lose the sole source of income that keeps Egypt partly afloat. And I say only partly because there's this huge unemployment. There's the massive corruption. There's the fact that the most menial job that gives you contact with a tourist is something that you've got to pay thousands of dollars, literally, in bribes just to get. And we're talking about a country where 75% of the population is under 30. And therefore, we're talking about basically a recipe for disaster. So I think the Muslim Brotherhood are pretty shrewd, and I'm pretty sure that even though they do want to have an Islamic State, they will try and sort of keep this the bright side of the Americans. But I don't think the country can work for long. That's the other thing.
Is there a cause for concern there that the Muslim Brotherhood, which currently is the largest party in parliament, could also win the presidency? They're poised to win the presidency as it stands. They could have the presidency and the parliament. Is that a cause for concern?
It looks probable that they will. Well, I think there's a bigger cause for concern, or at least for interesting speculation, which is the Muslim Brotherhood is an international organization. It has branches all over the place. Muslim Brotherhood Party is essentially running Tunisia now. Muslim Brotherhood Party is likely to run Egypt soon.
Tunisians, of course, would disagree with this.
Well, no, but the Tunisians, Ennahda is intimately linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. That's no secret. And that's not a condemnation. I think the question is, how are these parties, as they come to power, going to work together or not? And one of the places where this is going to be a real test, is really problematic, is in fact Syria, where we were talking before, because one of the most potent forces in Syria politically has been and will remain the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, we have to say that actually Egypt, apart from Egypt is an example itself that is really important to see what's going to happen in the other countries around. All the Arab Springs that we've seen lately, and if it doesn't work, if it comes to a chaos, if it comes to a disaster, well, my fear is not just for Egypt, but it's for other countries as well.
All right, well, we're going to have to go for a break right now, but do join me and my guests in just a few moments for the second part of The World This Week.